We have Felix Munoz-Garcia from Washington State University. He is an expert in I/O with applications to environmental economics, and connected with environmental economics.
Yeah.
And he has published in the leading field journals, Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, like one example. And okay, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You can start.
Yeah.
You have usually 45 minutes for presentation, and then we leave some room for discussion.
Thank you, Bern. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It's an honor to meet you finally here in Reus. The title of the paper is Optimal Patent Lengths in Polluting Industries. This is a joint work with Pak-Sim Choi. He was a former PhD student in our program. He's now at National Central University in Taiwan. And Eugenio Diaz-Fariña. He actually came just one semester to our PhD program, like an exchange student. And he's now an assistant professor at the Universidad de La Laguna in Canary Islands. And of course with Anna, you met her last week. So the paper is about patents. Patents, as we know, seek to balance this trade-off that we are going to talk about in a moment when we get into the literature. But basically it's the Nordhaus's trade-off, where if you provide one more year of patent, you are essentially accepting the monopolization of the industry for one more year. That's basically the cost, or the loss for welfare. But in return, the longer patent provides more incentives to firms to invest in order to be a monopolist, right, for a longer time. And once the patent expires, that technology, that cost-reducing effect that we are going to see, spreads into everyone because the patent becomes public. Right? So that's supposed to be the gain, the marginal dynamic gain of the patent. Right? This has been a very long debate, right? Whether the patents are currently too long, too short, whether they should be shorter or longer in some industries. So this is a very large body of the literature. We'll mention some of the papers in a moment. But it generally assumes that production then doesn't generate any environmental damage. And as a consequence, firms are facing no environmental regulation. Right? No emission fees, no quotas, nothing. So what the goal of the paper is to relax these assumptions, allowing for an EPA, an Environmental Protection Agency, to be present or absent to see what is the effect of the EPA's presence into elongating or shortening patents, okay? And also allowing for the patent office to ignore or consider pollution. Normally, patents office ignore pollution; they just consider consumer and producer surplus. But what would happen if the patent office considered pollution? Right? So the research questions are related with what I just mentioned, right? How are patent lengths affected by the presence of environmental regulation? What if the PO ignores or considers pollution? And then we measure what we call patent inefficiencies. Patent inefficiencies, for instance, are going to be whether the length of the patent should be longer than what the patent office provides when ignoring pollution, right? When actually there is pollution, right? Then there are like some more that we may talk about depending on the time. So I tried to squeeze all the literature in one slide. Sorry about being a bit jammed. So this all started with Nordhaus, as I mentioned, right? Identifying the trade-off, kind of in a verbal way, but not so much into a game theoretic way. But he already understood and pointed out this basically short-term loss and long-term gain, right, for society of providing one more year of a patent. And it has been extended along several dimensions, right? I mean, here are some examples, but we could cite many others. What is the optimal height of the patent, of the novelty requirement? So basically, if you bring an innovation to the patent office, how novel it needs to be in order for you to receive a patent. Right? And it was like by Van Dyck, O'Donoghue, and many others. There was also the optimal breadth of a patent by Klemperer and Shapiro and so on. And the licensing to other firms, rather than becoming like the patent owner, you just license the technology to other firms, by De Nicolo. I think there is actually another paper by De Nicolo and Galini. But basically, when it became really kind of way easier to manipulate and in a game theoretic manner was by this paper of Takalo in 2001, and later on by Belefran and Pate. But this is basically the IO literature. No environmental damage or regulation ever. Then the few papers we have found about allowing for environmental damages in an IO paper with patents, right, are these two. There is actually one more by Languinier, but it's very similar to the one in 2019. So basically in Gerlach et al., 2014, for instance, they assume that the R&D is in abatement. So basically you invest in order to make your production greener, right, to reduce the pollution intensity per unit of output. But that's not cost reducing. And that's exactly the opposite of what the patents literature considers. Most of the patent literature considers that you invest in R&D in order to decrease your costs, right? And that's not what Gerlach et al. Did. So we basically want to insert environmental regulation and pollution into the typical IO paper of patents. Then Languinier and Chaudhuri, they assume fixed patent lengths. So basically it's like the patent office is not a strategic player. It's just if you receive a patent, it's giving you these T years, right? But not deciding how long or short the patent should be. And on top of that, they assume exogenous fees, right? And we don't want exogenous fees. We want to make them endogenous in the model, right? So we'll be relaxing that assumption too. Okay. So the outline of the presentation, as you probably suspected, is that we will first talk about patents without environmental regulation. That will be basically the benchmark. There will be a patent office considering or ignoring pollution, but no environmental regulation yet. Then we will redo the model, but allowing for environmental regulation in order to compare the first two bullets and then figure out what's the effect of the presence of environmental regulation, right, of the EPA. And then we will go through a battery of extensions where basically we redo the model, relaxing some of the assumptions one at a time. One is what if the innovation is green, right? Reducing the pollution intensity of the product, right? What if the EPA is what we call Pigubian? You will see what we mean a little close to the end of the presentation. You'll have to wait a little bit. What if emission fees are uniform? And by that, basically what we mean in a nutshell is that the EPA is operating in a kind of rigid administrative setting and cannot revise emission fees very rapidly. Right? You will see again what we mean. And what if we have fixed patent lengths, as in Gerlach's paper, right? Instead of our paper, right? Then we'll conclude. Okay, so the model, as you can see, it's very straightforward. Linear demand, constant marginal costs, yet things will get kind of hairy in a moment. The R&D cost is convex. That's the typical R&D cost, which is convex in X, which is the investment in R&D, where gamma denotes R&D efficiency. So a higher gamma means you are less efficient, right? That's basically increasing your marginal cost. And a lower gamma means you are more efficient. Now, this literature often assumes that gamma is high enough to make X in equilibrium, basically your equilibrium investment, to lie between 0 and 1. And that's what we do here too, in order to be able to interpret X as essentially the probability of an innovation happening. Right? And that's what we basically this is kind of following very closely Takalo. Right? Then we have to consider three settings. one without innovation, then everyone's costs are still C, and we are in a perfectly competitive market with no profits. Right? Then if an innovation happens, we are going to have a patent period lasting for T years, and then after the patent expires, right? So during the patent period, the innovator's costs drop from C to C minus alpha, where alpha is denoting the cost reduction effect, right, of the innovation. If alpha is 0, your costs don't decrease. If alpha is C, your costs decrease all the way to 0. And after the patent expires, the patent becomes public, your innovation becomes public, everyone's costs drop to C minus alpha, and everyone's profits become 0. Okay, so what's the time structure of the game? In the first stage, the patent office chooses the patent length T, right, with the following welfare function, right? It's consumer surplus, producer surplus, and environmental damage. Right? Environmental damage is the standard one in Lambertini's papers and Pollago, Theotoki. I mean, the typical convex expression, where D is going to matter a lot, because basically that is the weight that the patent office assigns to environmental damage. You could claim that in many countries D is 0, right? Because the patent office doesn't care about environmental damage, and that's a special case in our model. Right? D is allowed to be 0, but otherwise is between 0 and 1/2. It's below 1/2 because otherwise we could run into corner solutions where the EPA, in a moment, shuts down production altogether. Right? So then in the second stage, the innovator observes T, the patent length, and chooses how much to invest in innovation, X. The third stage, the EPA sets emission fees with this welfare function, which is symmetric to the one of the PO, right? Except for the fact that the environmental damage has this parameter B, right? Where B is greater than D, right? Meaning the EPA cares the same or more about the environment than the PO does, right? But it allows for many special cases. One is that the two agencies are symmetric. Another one is that D is 0 while B is positive, right? And many others, right? So as you can suspect, the asymmetry between the two agencies, right, between D and B, is going to matter and dictate the results. And in the fourth stage, firms choose their output level. Okay, so let's get into the benchmark case with no environmental regulation. So we solve the game by backward induction. This is just a complete information game. So before the patent expires, the innovator is receiving this patent, and its output, its monopoly output is this one, right? It's the standard one in monopoly with the corresponding price. Now the innovation, this is a typical assumption in this literature, must be non-radical, right? Meaning that this PM is greater than C, or otherwise alpha is not too big. Notice that otherwise the patent, the legal protection of the patent would be irrelevant, right? Basically, if I could set a monopoly price and yet my price was below the marginal cost of all my rivals, I wouldn't need to be protected by law, right? It is because my price under a monopoly scenario is higher than everyone's marginal costs that I need a legal protection of the patent, right? So then for the innovator to be the only seller, we need that the patent price is equal to C. So basically, I know that the monopoly price is higher, but I will just set a price equal to C, right, where epsilon is converting to 0, and that will give me these profits, right, in every patent period. After the patent expires, as we already said, everyone's costs drop from C to C minus alpha, interacting in a perfectly competitive market, and profits are 0, right? So nothing new there. Now, we will backward induct. In the second stage, the innovator anticipates its profits during the patent period, phi P, and after the patent expires, pi C, and chooses X in order to solve that expected profit maximization problem. So this is essentially my profits if I happen to innovate, my profits if I don't, and my certain costs from investing in R&D. Right? So these are expected profits and the last term is certain cost, right? Now, this term, the profits in the case of an innovation, are essentially the discounted stream of profits from a patent, right? Which is coming from the patent years, from 0 to t, right, pi p, and after the patent expires, pi c, which we know is 0, right? So this gives us this expression. This expression, one important thing to notice is that that's increasing in t, right? Meaning that the longer the patent, the bigger my profits, right? The discounted stream of profits, and as we will show in a moment, the bigger my incentives to invest, right, in R&D. That's confirmed in lemma 1 in the paper, where we solve that profit maximization problem and show that that equilibrium x is increasing and concave in t, increasing in alpha and decreasing in gamma and r. So basically, longer patents provide me with more incentives to invest, but at a decreasing rate. Right? And those more incentives to invest I have more incentives to invest if the innovation is less costly, right? So basically, if gamma is lower, or more effective if the drop in costs is bigger. Right? And then we get into the first stage. First stage is the PO, anticipating the equilibrium x that will happen tomorrow, and choosing t today, right? The patent length today. Notice that if you are in the shoes of the PO, you know that if the innovation occurs, this is the social welfare that is going to happen, right? During the patent years and after. If there is no innovation, this is the welfare that you will have without the innovation. And this is just the cost that you are internalizing as part of welfare from the innovation, right? From the R&D. I mean, you could include that in W, but you can also factor it out, right? Now, one important thing to notice before we solve for t here is that while profits are higher during the patent years than after, right? I mean, this is positive and this is 0. Welfare doesn't necessarily have the same ranking. Right? Welfare during the patent is higher than after the patent expires if D is high enough. Well, the intuition for that is the typical explanation where you are a regulator and you are trying to address two market failures at once. Right? Here, the two market failures is the monopolization. The monopolization of the market and the environmental damage. Right? So if the environmental damage D is big enough, you are better off in a monopoly, right? In a polluting monopoly, than in a perfectly competitive market with very low costs, right? Because the patent is now public, right? Where everyone is polluting. Right? If instead D is lower than that ratio, then it will be the other way around, right? You would prefer, basically the welfare would be higher after the patent expires than otherwise. Of course, that condition becomes more demanding when alpha increases, right? So making that is less likely to arise. And if you differentiate with respect to t, you obtain basically Nordhaus's trade-off. Right? Here, the trade-off is coming from the so-called marginal dynamic gain of a longer patent and the marginal static loss of a longer patent. Right? Notice that the marginal dynamic gain is coming from the fact that firms have more incentives to invest. Right? X increases in t. Okay? While the marginal static loss is coming from the fact that, well, that R&D investment is costly for the firms, right? And also for consumers, because the patent is longer, and that is basically allowing the monopoly to exist for one more year, right? Then in the paper, we characterize the comparative statics of this MDG and MSL curve, right? Showing that the MDG is monotonically decreasing in t, while the MSL increases and then decreases in t. But really the important thing here, I mean, this was basically, if you go to Takalo's paper, you could reproduce similar results to this. But then the question really is what happens when you introduce environmental damages, right? Something that is completely ignored in Takalo's paper. Well, what we show in the paper is that both curves shift downwards. So if you go back to the first order conditions, The introduction of D decreases this term, right? This social surplus, right? While not changing this. So MDG shifts down. This is unaffected, but this is actually increasing in D. The reason being that like a more polluting output makes the that extra year, right, beneficial for society, right? Because you are basically allowing the monopoly to exist one more year, which prevents pollution for one more year, right? So that's why the two curves shift down. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem, because depending on how they shift downwards, you could have that a longer patent or a shorter patent exists, right, depending on where they cross. And what we show also is that the MSL, shifts downwards more significantly than MDG, lengthening the patent, right? So basically the effect of allowing for a longer monopoly dominates, right? Then we characterize the optimal patent as a function of the parameters, including D, right? Showing that it increases in D, decreases in alpha and C, right? So the intuition, as we were already pointing out, is like these longer patents generate kind of a pollution savings, where the monopoly reduces output and pollution while the patent is in force, right? This, to our knowledge, is a novel role for patents that we haven't seen in the literature. Of course, it's not a perfect policy tool, right? It doesn't correct for the externality completely, right? That will happen with the EPA in a moment, but at least it helps attenuate the patent, right? And then we can measure what we mentioned before as the patent inefficiency from the PO ignoring pollution. That would be the difference between this, where this is evaluated at D, and this optimal patent evaluated at 0, right? As if D was 0. And we show that that's unambiguously positive, but decreasing in alpha. That decreasing in alpha is also important, meaning that if you're a patent office and you ignore pollution, you are going to generate really big inefficiencies if alpha is small, but small inefficiencies if alpha is big, right? Or in other words, if you are the patent office and you are ignoring pollution, well, it's okay, right? It's okay in terms of inefficiencies if alpha, if the cost reducing effect of the innovation is substantial, right? Okay, then we jump into introducing environmental regulation. The fourth stage of the game is very similar, where now costs are augmented by tau, right? Where that's the emission fee. Those are the profits during the patent years, and after the patent expires, everyone's costs drop by this much, and profits are 0, right? So similar to what we had in the fourth stage before. Then in the third stage, if you remember from the time structure of the game, is when the EPA operates, right? In the paper, we characterize emission fees without innovation and then with innovation, both during the patent years and after, right? Basically N, P, and C, respectively, and go through all the comparative statics. But basically here I'm trying to reduce the amount of formula and basically get to the basics. One of the results we show is that, as probably you could anticipate, emission fees satisfy this ranking, meaning that if you are the EPA and you anticipate, the more output you anticipate tomorrow, right, in the output stage, the more stringent the emission fee you need to set today, right, to curb pollution. That's why the emission fee after the patent expires and everyone's costs are really low is the biggest, right, it's the most stringent, followed by the emission fee if there is no innovation, and followed by the emission fee if there is a patent, which is basically a monopoly, right? And in addition, we show that the emission fees become more stringent when pollution is more damaging, right? So higher B, and when output is more costly, a higher C or a lower alpha, right? Or basically a higher C minus alpha, right? The net cost. We also show that these two emission fees are unambiguously positive, but the emission fee during the patent years, right, in monopoly is positive only when B is higher than a certain cutoff, right? which follows the same intuition as before, right? You are trying to tackle, now it's the EPA trying to tackle two market failures, monopoly and environmental damage. And basically, if B is high enough, it means that the market failure coming from the environmental damage dominates, right? Otherwise, you would be actually subsidizing, right? This would be negative, right? Subsidizing if, for instance, B is 0, right? Or B is sufficiently low. Again, backward inducting, we get into the second stage where we find X, and in here, that expression of X is this one, relative to the one with no EPA. I mean, in the paper, again, we go through the comparative statistics, but one part that we are interested in is comparing that relative to the benchmark with no EPA, right? So what we show essentially in that lemma is that not only the absolute investment level is lower when the EPA is present and absent, but also the marginal effect of a longer patent, right, into investment incentives is smaller when the EPA is present and absent, right? Basically in math is this, right, and this. So basically this is just that I'm investing less when the EPA is present and absent, and this is saying that if you give me 1 more year of patent, I'm going to increase my investment in both scenarios, with and without patent, EPA, but I'm going to increase my investments more if the EPA is absent than otherwise. That's basically because I can reap more profits, right, if the EPA is absent than present, right? And that is decreasing in B and gamma, right? If that is basically decreasing at the end of the day in the stringency of the emission fees. Then we get into the first stage, the patent office decision, right? And first we show that the social welfare that will go into that long expected welfare maximization problem satisfies this condition, right? Meaning that social welfare in every period, right, is going to be higher with than without EPA. Right? That is not really surprising, right? Because the presence of the EPA basically induces a first best welfare, right? Both before the patent expires and after the patent expires, right? Thanks to the emission fees, right? Basically, those emission fees that we talked about were like a very fine-tuning thing that the EPA, a tool, right, that the EPA has in order to exactly induce the socially optimal output in every period. It didn't matter if we were including the patent, after the patent, or if no innovation happened, right? Leading to the first best welfare in every period, right? Now you are probably wondering, what if the EPA is not so sophisticated, right? What if they cannot revise emission fees that quickly? That's actually one of the extensions we'll go through in a moment. But then once we have that, we go through the first order condition with respect to T, and that gives us an MDG and an MSL curves similar to the ones we had in the benchmark case. But what we are interested, of course, is what is the comparison of MDG and MSL with and without EPA, right? What we show is that both of them shift upwards, right? And again, the question is whether they shift upwards in this way, with MDG shifting less, right? And then T decreasing relative to the setting with no EPA, or like this. And then the pattern should be longer than in the setting without EPA. Well, what we show, we find the optimal T, that T1, that's actually a large expression I didn't even want to copy and paste here. That's a proposition 2 in the paper. But the bottom line is that it increases in B, right, in how much the EPA cares about the environment, but it decreases in D. Remember that without EPA, it was increasing in D, alpha, C, and R, right? So the idea here with this, let me see if I can kind of make sense of this figure. So if we start in this line, right, this is the case in which EPA and PO are completely symmetric in their environmental damages, right? Basically B is equal to D, right? and D is D, which is in the x-axis, right? So, by the way, the x-axis is D, how much the PO cares about the environment. The y-axis is the patent length. And the first argument in the T1 is how much the EPA cares about the environment. Right? So first of all, if the two are completely symmetric in their environmental concerns, the patent length is just flat, right? And here is 27, but you can do like a different simulation and it will be exactly flat. Not only flat, it is identical to Takalo's result. Right? Notice how kind of sexy that result is. But basically that means is that if I'm the PO and I know that the EPA tomorrow, the EPA cares the same amount I care about the environment, I can literally ignore everything and behave as if environmental damage didn't exist. Right? In other words, I can delegate into the EPA in order to correct the externality tomorrow, because I know they care the same much I do today, right? Now, what happens if that doesn't happen, right? If there is an asymmetry between the preferences of the two players, the two regulatory bodies? Well, if B starts to grow, right, then you have this dotted line, right, with T1 decreasing in D, but still reaching that level, right, when the two are completely symmetric. So basically, when D is exactly 0.25, this dotted line will continue flat all the way down here. Right? What that means is that when we have an asymmetry between PO and EPA, as a PO, I know that the EPA cares about the environment more than what I do. Right? They are essentially going to be very stringent tomorrow in the emission fees they set on firms, producing a big drop in profits for the firms, and as a consequence, I kind of compensate, right, that drop in profits, which ends up producing a drop in investment incentives, right, by providing longer patents today. Right? And that keeps happening if the EPA cares even more about the environment. Right? So basically an upward shift in that curve. So the way we see this, it's kind of reminiscent or helping us kind of, like related to an agency problem with a principal and an agent, right? So the principal in this relationship is the first mover, the PO, setting a patent length T to induce a socially optimal output according to its own environmental damage function, right? Which was D, right? The little that has that D. The agent in this relationship is the EPA acting later, responding to T by setting tau, the emission fee, to induce its own socially optimal output according to B. Right? If B is equal to D, really there is no agency problem. Right? If you are the PO and you know that the EPA is acting later, you have essentially a perfect representative of your own preferences. And then I can basically delegate into the EPA to correct the pollution, the externality, and I can behave as a la Takalo, right? So basically ignoring pollution altogether, just in a standard IO setting with no environmental damage function. If B is greater than D, however, the PO anticipates stringent fees, as we were mentioning, lesser than the investment, and then sets longer patents. Right? Then this difference would be the patent inefficiency due to the agency problem, right? Or due to the preference asymmetry, right? So basically, if we were symmetric, I would set this patent length, but because we are asymmetric, I need to set this patent length, probably providing basically very long patents just to essentially correct that preference asymmetry. Then we go through different comparisons in the paper, comparing, for instance, the optimal patent with and without EPA, right? T1 and T0. What we show, as I kind of gave away at the beginning of the presentation, is that when the two agencies are very asymmetric, this is B and D in the Y and X axis, So when we are in this northwest region, the two agencies are very asymmetric, and the patent is longer with than without EPA. But when agencies are more symmetric, right, here close to the 45-degree line, then the patent is actually shorter when the EPA is present and absent. So the intuition is kind of repeating ourselves. With our regulation, TO was trying to solve two problems at the same time, providing the right incentives to innovate, as in the typical patent literature, but also trying to correct for pollution, yielding TO to be large for many values of D, right? You were kind of providing these pollution savings, providing long patents. But with regulation, the PO can reduce T relative to T naught, T0, especially if agencies are symmetric, which is exactly what happens here, right? And that's why we have this result. Otherwise, it's the other way around. So how am I doing in terms of time? What time is it?
You still have 5-10 minutes.
Oh, okay, okay. So yeah, what I tried to do in the last like 3 or 4 slides is to try to summarize each extension in one slide or so. So let's see if it makes some sense. So the first extension, I mean, in the paper we provide these kind of long appendices characterizing all the results again, but then just summarize them verbally close to the discussion section. So in the case of green innovations, right, so far innovation was only reducing costs, but in this extension we allow for innovation to also decrease the pollution intensity, right, from B to B minus lambda 1, that's for the EPA, and from D to D minus lambda 2 for the PO. Of course, that also allows for the case in which lambda 1 and lambda 2 are identical, right, and the drop for both agencies is symmetric, right? Well, when we introduce this extra benefit of investing in R&D, what happens with the patents is that essentially, in order to use the same figure as we started with, is that this is the opposite. Basically, a lower B induces less stringent fees. A lower B, remember this is for the EPA, induces less stringent fees for the EPA. Less stringent fees increases your profits in every period, inducing more investment in R&D, which means that the PO can provide shorter patents, right? So basically that would be this arrow pointing downwards. But a lower D, right, induces longer patents, right? So basically you will be moving in a new patent curve, you will be moving leftward along the curve, right? Then the question, of course, is which effect dominates, right? The effect of B or the effect of D. And what we show is essentially that when the two effects are very symmetric, or the one of lambda 2, basically this one dominates, right? Basically this one, this second arrow dominates, you are going to have this shaded area where the introduction of the new benefit, the introduction of the lambdas, so to speak, is going to lengthen the patents, right, relative to the setting of T1 without lambdas. But otherwise, right, in here, the introduction of these green innovations is going to shorten patents, right, meaning that this effect dominates this second arrow, right. The second extension is allowing for a Pigouvian EPA. By that, basically we mean this. Right? So rather than considering the social welfare function we talked about before, what we consider is this kind of beast, which allows for different special cases, right? So this is a typical functional form in the literature, which if you make beta equal to 1/2, all of these objective function reduces to the one we had in the paper, right? With just consumer, producer, surplus, and environmental damage. If beta is 0, the objective function simplifies this expression, right, as you can call a utilitarian regulator who doesn't care about the environment. And if beta is 1, it reduces to this expression, right, not considering consumer and producer surplus, which is often referred as a Pigouvian regulator, right, who only tries to minimize pollution. Right? So then you can think of beta as that an increase in beta makes the EPA more Pigouvian, right, more concern about environmental damage alone. So what we show, as expected, is that an increase in, more stringent fees, even only if beta is greater than 1/2, right? Implying less pollution. But that makes the PO's pollution control via longer patents, as we talked before, right? To become less necessary. Right? So in other words, as a highlight, more Pigouvian EPAs leads to shorter patents. Right? Extension number 3 is the one about uniform emission fees that I mentioned before, right? So imagine that you are in an administrative setting or a political setting where changing emission fees from one year to another is very difficult. You need like a supermajority in Congress or something. So, so you cannot revise emission fees after, like before and after the patent expires, right? So it's like you have to commit to one emission fee for the future. Then we characterize what that tau u is, right? Showing that essentially it's a linear combination between tau p and tau c, right? So that basically means that you are setting a patent somewhere in between the really lax patent you were fixing during fee that you were setting during patent years to a monopoly, and the very stringent fee that you were setting after the patent expires, and you set somewhere in between, right? And so what that means is that the PO anticipates less stringent fees, right? Here, but more stringent fees relative to the patent years, and that will be yielding more pollution, right? After the patent expires, and that ultimately means that the PO sets longer patents to help curb this additional pollution. And one last extension we did was to say, well, what would happen if the PO was essentially a non-strategic player, meaning that they just set a fixed patent length, T, a capital like T bar, right? Which is often the case, actually, in many countries. You go with a new innovation to the patent office, and if you pass the novelty requirement, they will give you like 15, 20 years, depending on the country, right? Rather than saying, well, your alpha was this or this, and then you have only 5 years or 32, right? So, so of course that's problematic, because now with the paper we know what the optimal patent length is. It's T1. So what we show is that in order for T1 to be exactly, basically this is kind of a coincidence, right, equal to T bar, right, it only happens in this so-called isopatent curve. So the isopatent curve is essentially pairs of B and D for which the patent length is exactly equal to T bar, right? Just like you do in like 101, right? With a preference, with a indifference curve, right? So the idea is that we can show in the paper that this isopatent curve is increasing in D and also lies above the 45-degree line. What that means in words is that if the PO becomes more concerned about the environment, right, if you move a little bit leftward, the concern for the environment of the PA needs to grow more than proportionally, right, for you to remain in the same isopatent curve, right, for you to still provide the same patent length, right. If it doesn't, right, if it grows less than proportionally, you would actually be dropping to an isopatent curve in here, right, associated to a lower patent. So then, of course, we compare whether the T1 is greater than T bar or vice versa, and we show that that happens as expected when these two agencies are extremely asymmetric, and otherwise the optimal patent length is actually shorter, right? So basically that allows for these two scenarios. Notice that the first scenario is, again, in plain English, is just saying that the patents that you are providing with this non-strategic PO are too short. And in here, they are too long. Right? It's like you are giving too long of a patent to these innovators. Okay, so trying to summarize a little bit, when the EPA is absent, the optimal patent increases in D, right? This was the discussion of the PO trying to address these two market failures, and they were doing that by providing longer patents relative to Takalo. Alternatively, a PO that ignores pollution sets in sufficiently short patents, right? So basically, Takalo, a regulator at Takalo will be providing too short of a patent. But this inefficiency, kind of the caveat of that is that this inefficiency is small when the cost reduction effects are substantial, right? So it's like, well, don't start revising PO rules if your innovations are really dramatic, right? Are really low. They help firms decrease their costs substantially. When the EPA is present, we show that the opposite happens. The presence of the EPA induces longer patents. When the EPA is present, when the EPA is present, and PO are relatively asymmetric but shorter otherwise. And not only that, they are decreasing in D, right? So, which is the opposite of what we had when the EPA was absent. So that also matters because it's basically saying, look, depending on whether the EPA is present or absent, you should expect a different behavior by the PO, right? Then we went through these extensions and kind of to put them together with green innovations and uniform fees, patents become longer, right? Expanding the inefficiencies if the PO ignores pollution. And when you have a Piguvian EPA, we found more stringent fees, and that led ultimately to shorter patents. So in terms of policy recommendations, right, like when to revise PO guidelines, when is the most urgent, right, to revise PO guidelines? Really, as a very short summary, when innovations are green, when the EPA is relatively utilitarian, as opposed to Piguvian, and when regulation is rigid. In all of those settings, basically the PO guidelines need to be revised because otherwise that patent inefficiency we talked about would be really big. And that's all. Okay. I know. Was a little bit rushing at the end, but I hope I made some sense. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was very interesting. I know it's not possible in the framework you design, but it would be interesting to know in an environment with product differentiation and so on, that the firm that receives the patent after the expiration of the patent is still more cost effective than the rest. I mean, there are productivity gains which stick after the patent, and if this also affects the length and the profits of the firm in the long term.
So it's like allowing, that's what the literature often refers as the patentability requirement. So it's like, it's like I have a part of my innovation that is patentable, and that part ultimately becomes public, but there is a non-patentable portion that remains in the know-how of the firm, and that I don't lose it. Yeah, I mean, the issue with this literature is that they often assume that in the long run, that know-how ends up basically spreading into the whole industry. Like if we know how to do something in a factory that is not patentable because it's just some process we know how to do, eventually you are going to work for another company, or someone who worked for our company for a year is going to work for another company, and then that know-how will spread to everyone. But you started the question with product differentiation, but then you ended up going to cost.
Yeah, because according to this, every time that one firm is more cost effective, they will get, the firm will get a monopolistic position.
Yes.
So this allows for Stackelberg, something like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know if we are talking about the same. When you started the question with product differentiation, I thought that's an excellent idea for another extension or a short, like an extension paper, where all firms would be having product differentiation. Then I mean that complicates the analysis a little bit, because then you don't have zero profits after the patent expires, or in the event of no innovation.
Yeah, that was
But it opens the door to what happens, right? Yeah, you know, I will think about the product differentiation thing more. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is about cost innovation.
Mhm.
So you invest in order to reduce the production cost.
Mhm.
But many innovations in product innovation, right? You try to design new products, which in some case might be greener. For example, if you think about the car industry, electric cars, for example.
Yes.
So that's something totally different, right? Can you accommodate this setting in order to analyze this kind of question? What should be the optimal patent length there? And it's then the products, of course, they are not perfect. They are not homogeneous products. They are somewhat like substitutes. So you have electric cars, which are not exactly the same as other type of cars, but
yes, I mean, in one way we can accommodate, but it's imperfect. I mean, one way would be that in the green innovation extension, right? Imagine that alpha is very low. Basically, I invest in this electric car. The decrease in my costs is negligible, right? Alpha is very low. But the lambda, the reduction in pollution intensity for the EPA and the PO is super dramatic, right? Both consider this product super clean. But that still assumes that the product is homogeneous. Yes. So they will give me the patent. I will be able to sell that electric car for a number of years as a monopolist, as a legal monopolist. And once the patent expires, the technology I was using with the battery and everything becomes public knowledge, and everyone can imitate that technology. If I don't invest in product differentiation, with advertising or any different features my car has relative to other competitors, then we will be having a homogeneous product. But this is kind of connecting back to his question, like what happens if you have product differentiation and you allow for the extension of green innovation? Yeah, I mean, it's that's one way to accommodate that concern. And the other way is to say, throw that entire model off the window and go back to the literature I cited, the Langinier papers, where what they consider is an innovation where I invest only to abate or to make my production cleaner without affecting my costs at all, right? Although what I remember from her case, they assume homogeneous products too. So
yeah, but in fact it's a new product, right, that you have.
Yes, if it's a new product, yeah. Yeah, but the question is, other than clean, right? What feature does it make it new, right? Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, an electric car doesn't provide the same mile range, right? The same gas mileage as a typical car. There are all of these other features that distinguish the two or differentiate the two. So yeah, no, it's well, that's a good point. Actually, you could even do like that would be a completely different paper where you start from a setting where all products are homogeneous, and your investment not only helps you decrease your costs, not only decreases your B&D, right, because it makes it cleaner, it also creates that parameter beta, as in SAIG and Vives type of demand functions, right, where now your product becomes also differentiated relative to the rest. So by the time the patent expires, you are still protected by product differentiation. Right? Even if they have your technology, but then the question, and I know it's kind of, we are divagating here, but if they have my technology, what kind of differences in my product I can provide? Like my car is going to is going to be the same as your car if we are using the same machines, same everything, right?
But just if you see it from a monopolistic competition point of view, I mean, each firm has their market. It's less likely that another firm enters the market that one firm has already. So I think I mean, innovation besides innovation, it creates a prestige that maybe you, a consumer, is more prone to buy a French product than another firm.
But then more than monopolistic competition, we have to talk about vertical product differentiation, where that prestige, basically they know that this guy is Tesla, right? Rather than Seat or something, and they have way more experience with batteries. That would be vertical product differentiation. And then you have basically to tweak the demand function in order to say that there is this typical theta intercept, right, that makes one demand higher than the other. But no, I mean, the horizontal and vertical product differentiations are things we haven't considered, and it's important in this type of goods. No, I mean, the story with this paper is that we knew Takalo and some of these papers before, and initially we thought, okay, this must have been done, as usual, right, when you start some research. And we realized no one did, and then we thought, well, this is just going to be like a Nikon letters paper, something very short, where you just show how the typical results in the literature change. But no, it's I think it's 47 pages now, so it keeps going on and on with the extensions. So, that's something will happen to like 4 or 5 of you in a few years. You start with something thinking it will be something easy and doable in a few months, and a year later you keep adding things. So,
Okay. Thank you very much.
thank you.